Hello everyone, my name is Scott Bates and this is part one of graphing skills. Hopefully you watched the introduction video. So we're going to be going over the bar graph and histogram section. So you are going to have to insert two pictures in this section and answer some questions. Um, you can read all that if you would like. I highly suggest it. Right here is two great examples. Right here on the left is a simple bar graph and here on the right is a histogram. This is a very good pictures that the students refer to while they're working on this, and you can also refer to it as well. So as you notice, one big difference is the simple bar graph, they do not touch, while the histogram does touch. My students really enjoy the histogram more because they touch. But anyway, so for this section, you need graph paper or regular paper. It's easier on graph paper, but when I teach it, and I said this in my introduction video, I actually make my students use paper so I can really see the use of that ruler. So I want to give you I'm not going to do these graphs completely. I just want to show you kind of some tips of what we're looking for and stuff not to do. Because again, we're trying to think, and again, when you're doing this, try to think about what graphs do you want from your own students. So this is the first table, and this is where you have to make a bar graph. And as you can see, it has a title and stuff like that, as the calls and deaths per year. So we need to graph this. Now, I will show you just a few quick tips of some issues that arise with my students most of the time, and it's something that you need to watch out for as well. So when you are making a graph, like I said, I'm not going to do the full thing. Of course, even on graph paper, I mean, of course, you got the lines guiding you. There's nothing like a straight edge. You can definitely, I mean, just having the straight edge versus just using lines is way better. And I'm not a big, it's close to perfect. And again, I just freehanded. I mean, I didn't actually measure how long I wanted to make it, and that's something when I do this with my students, it technically can be as big as they want. I said if you want to be the full page, that's up to them. But I did tell them, the goal is can you accurately read the data from this graph? And as you can see here, one of the biggest hurdles is the calls. You notice the calls right here is the x-axis. So when you're doing this graph and you're actually going to insert this graph in for a grade, please make sure you have that x-axis labeled. Also, I'm trying to write as neat as I can. I don't have the prettiest handwriting. Not everybody does, obviously, but please try to write as neat as you can. Y-axis labeled, and then you also have that title. We are looking for that. Now, one thing about that I've noticed in my students when they're graphing, and something that's a big one, is if you have the y-axis this tall and you have the x-axis this long, you want to try to make sure you use every bit of it. Now, in retrospect, this graph is probably a little long for one bar graphs. I would actually, for this one, I'd probably make it to where my bars would be, 2 bars or two blocks long, so that when I am making it, it would make sense. But I will say this, and this is another mistake that my students like to make, is they'll do really good because, like I said, they use notebook paper and they'll measure and they'll make really good marks, but then they will not use the ruler to make that line. And the thing is, when you make that, it does make a difference. Well, they have to on notebook paper, but even on graph paper, like I said, I actually just went left to right with my ruler, and you can still tell that it's not straight, and I see that all the time. But I'm very strict on my students with that, just because I want them to see how neat of a graph they can make. Because when they make that neat graph, you just see the face of they're like, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. It's like a book. And so, but anyway, the other issue is, so you do obviously are going to be putting numbers right here. That is going to be the deaths per year, millions. So on the y-axis, and again, you got to figure out what number to go by. And again, you want that since this is, this tall, and again, this is not accurate completely. You'd want, somewhere up here, you'd want that 16.9 million, whatever you go by. And you also want to make sure, and another mistake that I see is with my students, and it's probably the same with y'all, is they would just put numbers down: zero point 0.9, 2.3, 3.5, instead of going, by the like going by twos, going by fours, going by what they're supposed to. They just put those numbers. That's a mistake I see all the time. But anyway, watch out for those mistakes, and that's the mistakes I see with my own students. Um, but one thing that's really cool that I've actually learned, I learned this from my students, is they're like, how do I write cardiovascular disease under this square and make it look neat and fit? And because, I mean, as you can see, mild, moderate, severe, it's written under the bar. And one cool way that I noticed was, and I mean, normally I'd say, well, just use more than one square, and, just to write as neat as you can and kind of abbreviate. And, that's as neat as I can get it, but it's still very hard to read. I've had one student, or it's actually more than one student, but, they're doing the little bar graphs, whatever, and they actually, so this is cardiovascular disease. Let's do cancer and tumors in the second one. They just actually put CT, and they abbreviated all of them. So again, right here, I'll make another bar graph right here. They did infectious diseases, so ID, and I thought, man, that was cool. And they even went a step ahead of me because they just wanted to use the ruler more, and they made an extremely nice key for me. So I knew exactly. And again, they used that ruler completely, and I knew what, that CT equals, and they provided a key. And it was just something that they came out with their own. I was like, because I mean, I just gave them 7 minutes. I need to be able to see each bar graph. So I thought that was kind of crazy for that one. But like I said, all those mistakes that I just described are some of the things that my students do, and some of the mistakes when you're trying to teach this lab, what you will see if you actually haven't taught graphing. And I know several different graph mistakes that I've left out just because there's so many that I didn't cover. But after you make your very neat looking graph, you scaled it correctly, and you have all this stuff, please insert that picture right here. Try again, think about what you want your students' graphs to look like. Now, going to the histogram, I did went over a majority of the mistakes that I saw during the bar graph, but I'm going to go over a different type of mistake for the histogram. So the histogram is very similar to the bar graph. As you can see up here, again, referring to it, it's very similar. Like I said, you would put the y-axis here, obviously, but then right here, so from here to here is the range from, like, so for this one be 0 to 10, then 11 to 20, and 21 to 30, and you would just follow along with that range. And this right here will be your y-axis. You have to pick a number to go by. And after you get that graph done, you are going to insert the picture of the histogram there. And just one thing that I will mention that we're also looking for, I'm going to get a different section, that we're looking for, or not looking for. It's a big mistake, and this is probably one of the bigger mistakes for my students. So, of course, using my ruler, my straight edge to get a straight graph, whatever. And again, and like I said, I kind of rushed it, and it wasn't directly on the line, so take your time with this. But we are looking for very straight lines. Like I said, that does happen occasionally, but the thing is, I've noticed, and this is probably the biggest mistake I see. Now, this is not just talking about histograms. This is talking about just graphs in general. So that histogram, is very similar. You could do like, so let's see, freeze. Okay, there we go. My little camera froze. Anyway, so like I said, this is the first bar right here. So this would be the, the 0 to 10, and then the second bar right here would be 11 to 20, and I would keep on going and so on. And again, for this, please don't forget to do the x-axis, the y-axis, label them, and the title. Very easy to forget the title. And the table does have a title name. And of course, you need to go by a certain number. What now? Now this is what I've noticed. So this graph is this tall and this wide. It needs to be full. It needs to go all the way through. And one of the biggest mistakes I see with not just my students, I see it a lot in classrooms, especially the math classrooms, is their graphs only cover like, let's see, this is something not to do, but pretty much, so their graph, so the top number is 72.6. So they'll either make this mistake on graphs, and not just bar graphs, histograms, on line graphs too. They will either go by the y-axis, so they're going to go by, they'll start off with 4.5, 9.7, and so on. So the scaling isn't correct. Or that top number is 72.6 right here. They'll put that set, they'll go by 10s, or they'll go by 15s or 20s. And so their 72.6 is right here, or like 75 or whatever. So it's right there. So when they graph it, and again, make sure to tell them to use the ruler. And again, we're looking for extremely neat looking graphs, because, when you have a bar graph that's really neat, and like I said, that's a little bit better hand drawn, but still using that ruler. And again, when they actually do this, like I'm going to try to rush this just a little bit, like they'll notice that trend and stuff, but notice how much waste is all right here. To have that full graph, they can see the data way, like, much better. And that's one of the biggest issues that I see, especially with line graphs, the line graphs in general. Now this graph, because it's a bar graph or histogram, it's very easy to see the data. Even if it is, they waste this much space. But because that graph isn't fully optimized, a lot of times they can't read the graphs incorrectly. And again, you'll see that in the line graph section. Now I'm going to briefly describe the questions that you have to answer with this lab. So this video is a little long, but anyway, so you're going to insert your picture of your histogram right here. Please make sure it's neat, labeled correctly. Don't forget the title, x-axis, y-axis, and make sure you use the correct scaling for y-axis. Again, you can use whatever you'd like, but you definitely don't want to. You want to go by the same number for sure. But here you're going to use these pictures of the graphs you made, which hopefully you have them right in front of you, so you don't have to go back and forth. I want you to answer these questions. And again, think about how are your students going to answer these questions. And I mentioned, like, some with the topics I've been talking about while doing these graphs, I was mentioning part of this, like what's the importance of scaling. And again, the biggest section, and this does with the importance of this lab, is that are they able to answer these questions with a table versus the graph they made? And that's the point you're trying to get across, because this right here is the same information as the graph you just made, your histogram. But what is easier to read, this table or the histogram? And it just kind of blows their mind when they get to that section. So that is going to be, so please make sure you answer these questions fully, and make sure you insert the pictures, your histogram right here, and insert a picture of your bar graph right here. So that's going to be the end of part 1, and part 2 will cover the line graph section.